A single dad heard crying inside the CEO's mansion. What he found changed everything. The night Liam Parker heard crying inside a darkened mansion worth several $1,000,000, he was supposed to be fixing a pipe. No lights, no security guard. No one answered when he knocked. Just that sound, faint, desperate, barely audible above the hiss of rain against stone, drifting from somewhere deep inside the home of the most powerful woman in the city. He had every reason to walk away. The job didn't require him to go inside. The rules were clear. But when that soft, broken sound reached him again through the dark, something older than reason took over. And Liam Parker stepped through the door. If you've ever believed that wealth and success mean a person has everything figured out, stay with this story until the very end. The city of Harlow Ridge was the kind of place that looked different depending on which side of the hill you lived on. On the east side, cul-de-sacs wound through neighborhoods of modest homes, with rusting gutters and second-hand pickup trucks parked in narrow driveways. On the west side, the side most people only ever saw from a distance, the estates sat back from private roads behind iron gates and perfectly sculpted hedgerows, their windows glowing like quiet lanterns in the dark. Liam Parker had grown up on the east side, worked on the east side, and largely kept to the east side. He was 34 years old, lean from years of manual labor, with hands roughened by tools and weather, and the kind of face that absorbed information without broadcasting reaction. He was the sort of man who fixed things: broken pipes, faulty circuits, rattling HVAC units, the kind of man that people called when something had gone wrong and they needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. He didn't advertise. His work spread by word of mouth, which suited him fine. He wasn't looking to build a business. He was looking to pay the bills. His daughter's name was Mia. She was 7 years old and had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubbornness. And she was, by every measure Liam applied to his life, the reason he got out of bed every morning. She stayed with his neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, on the nights he worked late, which was most nights now that summer had arrived, and the call volume had picked up. Liam would come home past midnight sometimes to find Mia asleep on Mrs. Aldridge's couch with a picture book open across her chest, and he would carry her home without waking her, thinking that this small warm weight in his arms was the only thing in his life that still made complete sense. He didn't talk about her mother much. Her name had been Rachel, and she had died in a highway accident 3 years earlier during a rainstorm, on a Tuesday evening, while Liam had been finishing a job across town. He had never fully forgiven himself for not being there, even though there was nothing he could have done. Grief, he had learned, was not particularly interested in logic. Before the freelance work, before the slow rebuilding of a life that had come apart at the seams, Liam had spent 4 years working as a security systems technician for a firm called Apex Integrated Solutions. He had been good at it, methodical, detail-oriented, with a near-photographic memory for circuit layouts and access panel configurations. He had left under circumstances he didn't discuss. What he would say, if pressed, was that he had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to, had refused to stay silent, and had been shown the door shortly afterward. The experience had left a wariness in him, a tendency to assume that people who lived behind iron gates had gotten there by doing things they weren't proud of. He knew it wasn't entirely fair, but the wariness was there, woven into the way he watched and moved. And it didn't wash out easily. The job at the Hart estate had come through a property management contact named Dale Simmons, who called on a Thursday afternoon and offered a rate that was genuinely hard to refuse. The main water line running beneath the west wing had developed a slow leak, the kind that wouldn't cause immediate damage but would, over months, undermine the foundation. It was a 3-day job at minimum, possibly 5, depending on what they found when they opened the ground. Liam had hesitated. He knew whose house it was. Everyone in Harlow Ridge knew the Hart estate, knew the name above the gate, knew the silhouette of the roofline against the evening sky, knew the story, or rather the carefully managed absence of a story, that surrounded Isabella Hart. He had almost said no. Then he had thought about the electric bill sitting on his kitchen counter, about the school trip Mia had mentioned twice that week, about the crack spreading slowly across his truck's windshield that he had been ignoring for 2 months. He said yes. Isabella Hart was 38 years old, which surprised most people who assumed she had to be older to have accomplished what she had. She had founded Meridian Group at 26, initially a logistics consultancy that over the following decade had expanded into property development, private equity, and infrastructure investment. By the time she turned 35, the group had over 300 employees across 4 offices and a portfolio worth something in the vicinity of $600 million. She did not appear on magazine covers. She did not attend charity galas, unless compelled by board-level obligation. She was photographed rarely, and always seemed slightly displeased to be photographed at all. A tall woman with dark hair pulled back from a face that gave nothing away, standing at a measured distance from whoever was nearest, as if proximity itself was a risk she had calculated and chosen not to take. The stories about her were numerous and inconsistent, which was usually the sign of someone successful enough that other people needed to invent a narrative for them. Some said she was ruthless. Others said she was simply efficient, which in business often amounted to the same thing. Several former employees described her as demanding but fair, as long as you understood that fair meant she expected from others exactly what she expected from herself, which was everything. She had never been publicly linked to anyone romantically. She was not known to have siblings, living parents, or any family connections she acknowledged. To the outside world, Isabella Hart appeared to exist in a kind of sealed vacuum. A woman who had condensed her entire identity into professional achievement and left nothing visible outside of it. The estate reflected this quality. It was enormous, 12,000 square feet of stone and glass set on 4 acres, surrounded by a perimeter wall with reinforced iron gates, and a security system that Liam noted, when he first arrived, was significantly more advanced than anything a standard residential property would require. There were cameras at every corner, motion sensors along the wall, keypad access doors at multiple interior checkpoints. He recognized the hardware from his Apex days, high-end commercial grade, the kind used in data centers and government facilities. For a woman living alone, it was extraordinary. It was the architecture of fear, something designed not merely to keep the outside world out, but to keep something inside from being seen. The property management firm had arranged for Liam to be admitted each morning by a woman named Patricia, who served in some combination of personal assistant and estate manager capacity and spoke in the clipped, neutral tones of someone trained to reveal nothing. She showed him the work area, confirmed the parameters of the job, and made clear without explicitly stating it that the west wing and the rear corridor were not accessible to him and were not part of his assignment. The water main access point was in the east utility basement. He was to arrive no earlier than 8 in the morning and leave no later than 7 in the evening. These were the rules. Liam nodded and followed them. He was professional. He needed the money. He wasn't there to ask questions, but he noticed things, because noticing things was, at its core, simply who he was. He noticed that the West Wing's windows were always curtained, even during daylight hours, despite the house facing south and receiving excellent light. He noticed that the alarm panels he could see had indicator lights, suggesting zones beyond the standard configuration, more zones than the visible footprint of the house seemed to require. He noticed, on his second afternoon, that Patricia had come hurrying down the east corridor with a food tray covered by a white cloth, moving with the urgency of someone on a strict schedule, and had disappeared through a door he had not previously identified as active. She was back within 2 minutes. Whatever was on that tray when she went in, she carried it differently on the way back, more carefully, as if whatever had been placed on it had been barely touched, and she was not certain what that meant. Liam registered all of this the way he registered most things, quietly, without comment, filed away in some interior cabinet, alongside 100 other small observations that he didn't yet know the significance of. He went back to the pipe. He did his job. The third night came with weather. A late spring storm had moved in from the west during the afternoon, bringing with it the kind of low pressure that made old buildings creak and old wounds ache. Liam had stayed later than usual. A section of pipe had turned out to be corroded beyond what the initial assessment indicated, and rather than leave it unsecured overnight, he had pushed past 7 to complete the reinforcement. Patricia had long since gone. The main house was quiet in the way that large, nearly empty structures become quiet, not the natural silence of a place at rest, but the dense, pressurized silence of walls holding something in. He was in the utility corridor, working by the light of a headlamp, when the power went out. Not a gradual dimming, a total cut, sudden and complete. As if something had thrown the main breaker, his headlamp kept him functional. But the rest of the house fell into a darkness that was absolute. The security panels had gone dark too, which meant whatever had tripped the power had been significant enough to overwhelm the backup systems, or had deliberately targeted them. He set down his wrench and straightened up, listening. The storm outside, the sound of water in the pipes he had been working on, and then something else, something that stopped him mid-breath. It was a sound so small it might have been imagined, a child crying. Not loudly. Not with the full-throated volume of distress that demands attention. This was something quieter and, in its quietness, more unsettling, the sound of a child who had learned that crying loudly did not bring help, and had therefore reduced the act to something private and involuntary, like breathing or bleeding. It was the cry of a child who had already accepted that no one was coming. Liam stood very still. He told himself it was the pipes. Old houses made sounds. Pressure differentials could produce odd acoustics, and he was tired. He went back to the wrench. The sound came again. He stood up a second time and turned toward the interior of the house. The sound was not from outside. It was not from the utility corridor. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the structure, somewhere past the interior door, past the hallway, past the zones he had been told were not his concern. He held still for a long moment, running through the logic of it. There was nobody in the house. Patricia had gone home. Isabella Hart was, according to the schedule Patricia had communicated, in a meeting across the city that evening. The property was empty. He had been the only person on the premises for the better part of 2 hours. And yet, that sound. Again. Faint. Broken. Unmistakably real. Every professional instinct he had said to pack up, lock the utility access behind him, and leave. He could call Patricia in the morning and report the power outage. That was the rational response, the one that kept him employed and out of trouble. But somewhere behind the professional logic, something older was stirring, something that remembered what it felt like to carry a child who was too quiet, who had stopped calling out because she had learned that calling out did not always help. He picked up his headlamp, adjusted it, and walked toward the interior door. The house, without its lights, was a different place entirely. Liam moved slowly, keeping the headlamp beam low, navigating by memory and the architectural logic of the building's layout, a skill left over from years of working in structures whose blueprints he had studied, but whose interiors always surprised him. The main corridor was long and wide, lined with closed doors and framed art that his beam caught briefly as he passed. His footsteps sounded too loud despite his effort to step lightly. The temperature was cooler in here, the kind of cool that suggested heavy insulation or deliberate design. He paused at each intersection, listening. The crying had stopped for the moment, replaced by a silence so complete it had texture. He moved through the corridor that led toward the west wing, the area he had been told was off-limits, and stopped in front of a door set into the wall at a point where the corridor made a 90-degree turn. It was a plain door, the same matte white as the surrounding walls, with no visible handle, only a keypad access panel mounted beside it, the kind of panel he recognized immediately. This was not a closet. The access control for a storage room did not need a 6-digit commercial-grade keypad with a secondary biometric option. Whatever was behind that door had been secured with deliberate and significant intent. He crouched in front of the panel. The LED indicators were dark. The power cut had knocked the electronic lock offline, which meant the backup was mechanical only. He examined the door frame, running his fingers along the edge in the dark, feeling the strike plate, the latch bolt, the slight give in the door that told him the electronic lock's disengagement had not fully retracted the mechanism. A standard lockpick would not work on this, but a commercial electronic lock with a failed backup, that was a system he had worked with before. He knew the tolerances. He reached into his work belt, found a flathead screwdriver and a tension wrench, and began working the secondary mechanism with the practiced patience of someone who understood that forcing things was always the least efficient option. It took him 4 minutes. He heard the soft click of the bolt retracting. He stood, pressed his palm against the door, and pushed it open. The smell reached him first, a combination of fabric softener and something underneath it, older and stale. The smell of a room that had been sealed for a long time and only infrequently aired. His headlamp swept the interior, and he stopped moving entirely. The room was not large, perhaps 12 feet by 14. A narrow bed against one wall, neatly made. A small bookshelf, filled to capacity. A wooden table with a single chair, a sealed window, not curtained, but actually sealed, the frame painted over so many times that it had ceased to be operable. No visible light source beyond a small battery-powered nightlight near the baseboard that glowed a dim amber, suggesting it had been placed there by someone aware that the power might sometimes fail. The walls were plain, no art, no photographs. The only decoration in the room was a row of small paper animals, cranes, frogs, a rabbit arranged along the windowsill with the careful precision of someone who had a great deal of time and nothing else to do with it. And in the far corner, curled against the wall with a blanket pulled up to her chin, a child, a girl, small for her age, which Liam would later estimate at around 8 years old, dark hair matted from sleep, pale. Her eyes were open, and she was watching him with the particular stillness of a child who had learned to evaluate a threat before deciding whether to flee a watchfulness that did not belong on the face of a child who had been loved, openly and unconditionally. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply watched him, the way a small, wary creature watches something it is not yet sure is dangerous. Liam did not move for a moment. He kept his hands visible and lowered the headlamp so the beam pointed at the floor between them rather than at her face. He had learned, in the years of raising Mia, that sudden light and sudden motion were two of the fastest ways to frighten a child who was already afraid. He crouched slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice level and quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Liam. I heard crying and I wanted to make sure you were okay." The girl stared at him. She had wrapped both hands around the edge of the blanket and was holding it with the white-knuckled grip of a child, using it as the only available shield. Her breathing was shallow and fast, but she did not look away. Her name, he would learn in fragments over the next several minutes, was Evelyn. She offered it reluctantly, the way children offer personal information to strangers a piece at a time, watching for signs that it will be used against her. She was 8 years old. She had been in this room for what she described, with the imprecise time sense of a child, as a long time. She didn't know exactly how long. She had a collection of books that she had read many times over. She had paper she used for folding. She had a tablet she gestured toward it on the table that had wireless access to exactly 5 approved websites, all educational, none of them interactive in any meaningful way. She could not contact anyone with it. She had tried. She was thin in a way that was more than incidental. The bones of her wrists were too prominent. Her face had the hollow-cheeked look of a child who ate sufficiently but not abundantly, who moved little and spent long hours in a room without real light. She didn't appear injured. There were no bruises, no marks suggesting violence, but she had the particular quality of a small creature that had adapted to confinement, a stillness that was not the peaceful stillness of a calm child, but the managed, conserved stillness of a living thing that had learned to take up as little space as possible. "Does anyone else know you're here?" Liam asked quietly. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she said, with a directness that was somehow more devastating than anything emotional could have been, "My mother." He absorbed this. "Your mother knows you're in here?" Evelyn nodded. "My mother put me here," she said. She said it without accusation, without self-pity, simply as a statement of fact, the way a child states any fact they have had sufficient time to become accustomed to. And in that simple, flat, unemotional delivery, something in Liam Parker broke open. He asked, carefully and quietly, "What is your mother's name?" The girl looked at him as if the question were strange. "Isabella," she said. "Isabella Hart." And there it was, the thing that reorganized everything he thought he understood about the woman whose property he had been working on for 3 days. The CEO who was rumored to have no personal life, no family, nothing beyond the architecture of her professional self, had a daughter. A daughter who was 8 years old, thin and pale, surrounded by paper cranes in a sealed room at the back of a 12,000-square-foot estate, hidden from the world with the same thoroughness and deliberateness with which Isabella Hart hid everything she could not afford to show. Liam sat down on the floor not because he had decided to, but because his legs required it. He looked at the row of cranes on the windowsill, the tablet with its 5 approved websites, the neatly made bed, the bookshelf filled with read and reread spines, and the child watching him from the corner with cautious eyes that held, just beneath the surface, the most exhausting kind of hope, the hope of someone who has been disappointed so many times, they no longer allow themselves to feel it fully, but cannot quite stop feeling it entirely. He thought about his own daughter, asleep right now at Mrs. Aldridge's house, under no constraints except the hour and her age. He felt something that was part anger and part grief, and part of fierce protectiveness that extended itself, without permission, to include this child he had known for approximately 6 minutes. He spoke to her carefully, keeping his voice low and steady, asking only the questions that seemed essential. He learned that Evelyn had been in the room for approximately 8 months. She had tracked the seasons by the quality of light that crept in at the sealed window's edges. Watching summer shade into autumn, autumn into winter, winter into the pale tentative warmth of spring. She had been in other rooms before this one, she said vaguely, but this room was the one that had come after something bad happened. She did not say what the bad thing was. She pulled her knees up to her chest when he pressed gently on it and looked at the wall. And he decided not to push. Some things would come in their own time, or not at all, and forcing them helped no one. She received food 3 times a day, always brought by Patricia, the same woman Liam had noticed with the covered tray. She had a small bathroom through a door he had not yet looked at. She had books, paper, the tablet, and a collection of small stuffed animals arranged on the shelf with the same careful precision as the paper cranes. She had a schedule of sorts. Patricia brought food, and sometimes Isabella came in the evenings, sometimes for hours, sometimes for less than a minute, depending on something Evelyn described as how things are going at work. She said this with the borrowed vocabulary of a child who had absorbed adult phrases without fully understanding them, and the effect was quietly heartbreaking. "Are you scared right now?" Liam asked. Evelyn considered this with serious attention, as if it were a genuine analytical question. "A little," she said. "But not of you." Then she added, unprompted, "Please don't tell my mother you were in here." Liam looked at her. "Why not?" The girl picked at a loose thread on her blanket. "Because then she'll know the door can be opened," she said. "And she'll fix it." There was no drama in this, no performance of suffering. She said it the way you would say that rain makes the road wet as cause and effect, observed and accepted. But the words carried the specific weight of something Liam recognized in a way he could not immediately explain. The quiet adjustment to a situation that ought not to be adjusted to. The absence of protest from someone who had used up all their protests long ago. He understood, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives fully formed and sudden, like a light switching on that whatever Isabella Hart believed she was doing for her daughter, it had long since stopped being about protection. It had become something that wore the shape of care but functioned like control. He had seen it before, not in families, but in systems, in companies, in any arrangement where one person's fear of loss had been translated, without examination, into the removal of someone else's freedom. He could not leave. He told Evelyn he needed to go back to the utility corridor, that he would not tell anyone she had warned him, and that things were going to change. She watched him leave, and something in the quality of her watchfulness shifted slightly, like a held breath barely released. Liam stepped back into the dark corridor and stood there for a long time before he moved. He had been back in the utility corridor for less than 20 minutes, sitting on an overturned bucket trying to organize his thoughts into something actionable, when he heard the estate's main entrance opening. Headlights swept across the window above his work area, a car in the driveway, the sudden, purposeful arrival of someone who owned the place. He heard footsteps. He heard a voice, not Patricia's careful, neutral cadence, but a lower, more direct voice speaking in clipped, impatient tones. Then, silence. He had moved without making a conscious decision to. Stepping from the utility corridor into the edge of the main hallway, he came face to face with Isabella Hart at the point where the east corridor met the main foyer. She was taller in person than in photographs, or rather, she carried herself in a way that translated to height, a kind of held vertical quality that suggested she was always measuring distance. She was wearing a dark coat, her hair loose in a way that suggested the day had been long, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not so much surprised as it was instantly, precisely calculating. 2 men appeared from somewhere behind her security, not the kind who stood at gates and checked credentials, but the close protection kind, who moved with the particular economy of motion that came from professional training. They positioned themselves at her flanks without being instructed to, which told Liam they had done this before, and that their principal communicated threat assessments without words. The larger of the 2 took a step toward him. Isabella raised one hand, barely, and the man stopped. "You're the plumber," she said. It was not a question. It had the flat certainty of someone who had already identified him by description and was simply confirming the identification. You were supposed to be gone by 7. Liam met her gaze. He had prepared himself for a number of responses: apology, explanation, the deflection of a man who needed to protect his income. What came out of him was none of those things. "You're keeping a child locked in a room," he said. He kept his voice quiet. He did not gesture or raise his hands. He simply said it, factually, the way she had said things, with the flat weight of information that he was not going to allow to be minimized or redirected. The silence that followed was the most specific silence Liam had experienced in years. Isabella Hart did not flinch. She did not reach for a justification with any of the instinctive speed of a person who has something to hide. She simply looked at him, and what he saw in her face was not guilt, exactly, and not defiance, but the look of a person who has made a decision they cannot unmake, who lives inside that decision every day, and who has spent so long defending it in the privacy of their own mind that they have forgotten what it looks like from outside. "You went into the West Wing," she said. "I did," he said. "Your security system went down. I heard a child crying. I wasn't going to leave without knowing she was all right." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. The security men were still. Everything in the house was still. "Come with me," she said. She led him to a sitting room off the main foyer, a room that felt, unlike the rest of the house he had seen, as if it had been used recently and regularly. There was a glass of water on the side table, a book face down on the arm of a chair, a single lamp burning on backup power. The security men did not follow them in. She sat down, crossed her arms, and looked at him across the width of the room, and it occurred to Liam that this was the first time he had seen Isabella Hart in a space that held any evidence of her actual life. She told him, with the same controlled flatness she applied to everything, about a day approximately 8 months prior, when Evelyn had been found on the second-floor landing with a pair of scissors, attempting to cut through a curtain cord that was looped the way children's hands sometimes loop things without understanding the physics of what they're creating around her own neck. The doctors had concluded, after extensive evaluation, that she hadn't been attempting anything deliberate. She had been mimicking something she had seen in a book, without comprehension of its implications. It had been an accident, but in the 60 seconds before Isabella had reached her and lifted her from the floor, something had severed inside Isabella Hart that had not, in 8 months, been repaired. The image of those 60 seconds, the cord, the small slack weight, the silence of the landing, had not left her for a single day since. She described the subsequent weeks in the clipped, pressurized language of a person reporting facts they have not yet been able to fully feel. The medical consultations, the psychiatric assessments, a diagnosis adjustment disorder with anxious features, complicated by emerging social withdrawal that the doctors had been careful to frame as manageable and treatable, requiring patience and consistent therapeutic engagement. She had been told that Evelyn needed structured routines, reduced stimulation during recovery, careful monitoring. Isabella had taken this information and applied it with the same comprehensive precision she brought to her professional life, removing variables, controlling inputs, eliminating any factor that might constitute a risk. The problem was that she had done this alone, without the doctors she had initially consulted, without any ongoing therapeutic relationship for Evelyn, and without any significant input from Evelyn herself. Liam listened without interrupting, and the more she said, the more clearly he could see the architecture of it, not malice, not indifference, but a very specific and dangerous kind of love filtered through fear, until it had become indistinguishable from control. Isabella Hart had made her entire professional fortune by identifying threats before they materialized and removing them. She had applied this skill, with complete sincerity and complete blindness, to her child, eliminating the other children Evelyn might encounter, the outdoor spaces, the school, the therapists, the medical relationship, all of which carried uncertainty, and uncertainty was precisely what Isabella Hart had spent her career learning to remove. "She's getting better," Isabella said, at the end. It was the first statement she had made that Liam recognized as a lie, not a deliberate lie, but the lie that people tell themselves when the alternative is too large to look at directly. "When did she last see another child?" he asked. Isabella's jaw moved slightly. "She doesn't need when." Isabella stopped. The lamp flickered once. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. "There is no doctor," Liam said. "It was not a question. There is no therapy. There's no plan. There's just the room." She said nothing. She's not better, he said. She's quieter. Those aren't the same thing. The silence between them was different from the one in the hallway. That one had been tactical. This one was the silence of something finally spoken aloud that had been living too long in the dark. Isabella Hart sat very still, and Liam watched her face and saw not anger, which was what he had braced for, but the particular, specific devastation of a person who has just been shown, without embellishment and without cruelty, that the thing they have been most afraid of losing, they are in the process of losing by the very act of trying to hold it. He drove home that night through streets that reflected the streetlights in long orange shimmers after the rain, and he sat in his truck in front of Mrs. Aldridge's house for a long time before going in to collect Mia. His daughter was asleep in the exact position he had expected on the couch, one arm hanging off the edge in the careless way of a child who trusted completely that the world would hold her up even in sleep. He picked her up, and she stirred slightly and put her arms around his neck without waking. And he stood there in the small, warm living room, holding her, and thought about Evelyn in the cold room with the sealed window and the row of paper cranes, and he made his decision. He did not make it impulsively. He put Mia to bed and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while he considered every dimension of what he was about to do. He was a freelance contractor with no institutional standing, no legal authority, and no relationship to either Evelyn or Isabella beyond a 3-day plumbing job. If he acted and was wrong, he would lose the job and possibly face legal action for trespassing. If he acted and was right, which he was, completely certain he would still probably lose the job. The math was not in his favor. He thought about what 8 months in that room had already cost a child who should have been in 3rd grade, arguing about which cartoon to watch and complaining about homework and falling off bicycles. He thought about the word his own daughter used constantly, why, and how fundamental it was. How it was the engine of every child's development. He thought about a child who had stopped asking it, because asking had stopped producing answers. And then he thought, very precisely, I am not going to be the person who knew and did nothing. He called the city's Child Protective Services line anonymously. At just past 1 in the morning, he reported what he had observed: the age of the child, the conditions of the room, the absence of educational or therapeutic provision, without identifying himself. He was calm, specific, and factual. He gave the address. He described the access point. He answered every question asked. When the call ended, he looked at a school drawing of Mia's pinned to the refrigerator, a house with a yellow sun, and 2 stick figures in the yard, both with arms raised in the universal gesture of complete joy. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up, washed his coffee cup, and went to bed. He slept, for the first time in several nights, without dreaming. By the following Thursday, the news had broken. The story spread with the efficiency of information that had been sitting just below the surface of public awareness, waiting for a single point of entry, a confirmed detail that transformed rumor into record. The initial report came from a mid-level investigative outlet that had been monitoring irregularities in Meridian Group's corporate filings for unrelated reasons, and found, in the course of following up on the Child Protective Services investigation, a thread that led in unexpected directions. Within 48 hours, 3 larger outlets had picked up the story. Within 72 hours, it had the kind of traction that public attention assigns to stories, confirming something people half knew, but could not verify: stories about the distance between public persona and private reality, about the things that happen behind the gates and walls and curtained windows of lives that appear, from outside, to be entirely complete. The Child Protective Services investigation moved with a speed that reflected the clarity of what the first responders found when they arrived at the estate. Evelyn was examined, assessed, and placed in temporary supervised care within 24 hours of the initial report. The investigation documented the absence of medical or therapeutic care for a period exceeding 7 months. The physical conditions of the room, and the fact that the child had not been enrolled in any educational program, formal or informal, during the same period. Isabella Hart, through her legal counsel, cooperated fully, which was not surprising to anyone who understood her, because full cooperation was the only possible response to a situation in which there was nothing left to strategically withhold. The barriers had come down. The effect on Meridian Group was immediate and sharp. Stock in 2 of the group's publicly traded subsidiaries dropped significantly in the first week following publication. 3 board members requested emergency meetings. Institutional investors issued carefully worded statements expressing concern. Several major clients requested clarification of governance structures and leadership continuity. For a brief period, the business that Isabella Hart had built across 12 years of relentless effort appeared genuinely uncertain, not because of anything she had done professionally, but because the weight of what had happened privately had finally arrived in the space where her professional identity lived. What happened to Evelyn, once she was under therapeutic care, was something that clinicians who worked with her would later describe as both encouraging and instructive. Within the first 2 weeks she began speaking more. There was an initial period of cautious observation, but within 14 days she was engaging with therapists consistently, asking questions, showing the intellectual curiosity of a child whose mind had been turning, untested, in that sealed room for the better part of a year. Within a month she was asking about school. Within 6 weeks, the clinical notes described notable progress in social engagement and emotional expression. She drew pictures. She asked for more paper. She laughed at small, ordinary things with the spontaneous delight of a child rediscovering that the world contained material for laughter. The progress was not merely encouraging, it was a direct rebuttal of every assumption that had kept her confined. Isabella had believed, in the fear-reorganized logic of those 8 months, that her daughter was too fragile for the world. What the therapeutic environment revealed, week by week, was a child who was not fragile at all, or rather, fragile in the ways all children are, and strong in the ways all children can be, given the conditions that allow strength to develop. The problem had never been Evelyn's capacity. It had been the environment in which that capacity had been asked to exist. A sealed room and 5 approved websites and paper cranes and the absence of another human voice for days at a time. This was not the architecture of healing. It was the architecture of further damage, applied with great care and genuine love and complete misunderstanding. She called him 6 weeks after the night in the dark. He didn't recognize the number and almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. Her voice on the phone was different, quieter, less controlled in the way that comes not from weakness but from a decision to stop managing tone. She asked if she could speak with him. He said yes. They met at a coffee shop on neutral ground, one of those mid-block places nobody particularly loved or avoided, with worn chairs and good light. She arrived on time, dressed without the corporate armor of her public photographs, a dark sweater, hair loose, no visible evidence of the professional persona that had defined her to the outside world for the better part of a decade. She sat down across from him and did not begin with pleasantries, which he appreciated. After a moment sitting with her hands around a cup of coffee, she looked at him directly and asked, "Do you think I'm a monster?" The question was not rhetorical. She was asking for a genuine assessment, and the asking of it cost her something visible, a controlled person asking an uncontrolled question, which is always a specific kind of courage. Liam looked at her across the table. "No," he said. "I think you're someone who was terrified." She looked at him without speaking. He continued, because the question deserved a full answer. "You almost lost her once, and then you kept almost losing her in your head, over and over, for 8 months. Every decision you made came out of that place, out of those 60 seconds on the landing where everything could have gone a different way and didn't. That's not a monster. That's a person who got stuck inside a moment they couldn't get out of." Isabella set down her coffee cup. She looked at the table. "She could have died," she said. "Yes," he said. "She could have. But she didn't. And what you were doing wasn't keeping her safe from that. You were stopping time, keeping everything still so nothing else could happen. But she was still happening inside all of that, still changing, still needing things, still growing in directions you couldn't see, because you couldn't look." There was a long pause. Outside the window, the street was doing what streets do on ordinary afternoons, people passing, a bus stopping, a child on a bicycle wobbling through the frame, and then gone. "She asked about you," Isabella said quietly. "Evelyn?" She nodded. She asked the social worker if the man with the headlamp was okay. Liam looked out the window for a moment. Something in his chest moved. "She's doing well?" "Better every week," Isabella said. Her voice was careful around the words, the way you are careful with things that matter completely. "They say she's actually funny." "I didn't." She stopped, cleared her throat, started again. "I didn't know she was funny. I'd been with her every day for years, and I didn't know she was funny. Because there was nothing to laugh at in that room. That was." She stopped again, He waited. She did not continue, but she didn't need to. The sentence had said what it needed to say. He did not offer reassurance or absolution. Those were not his to give, and he understood that what Isabella Hart needed was already, evidently, in the process of finding was not absolution, but something harder and more useful. The slow, honest work of changing. He looked at her across the table and saw a person at the beginning of that work, which is the only place it can ever start. "She's going to be all right," he said. It was not a prediction. It was a statement about what was already true. The weeks that followed moved with the quiet efficiency of real change, incremental, undramatic, perceptible only in accumulation. Isabella entered a therapeutic program of her own, at the recommendation of Evelyn's clinical team, and attended with the consistency she brought to everything she decided to do. She was a challenging patient, rigorous, analytical, resistant to frameworks that felt imprecise, inclined to arrive at sessions with prepared questions, as if chairing a meeting, but she kept coming back. Over time, the visits with her daughter shifted from supervised to semi-independent. The semi-independent visits began to include outdoor spaces, and the outdoor spaces began to include other people. Each expansion was survived. Nothing irreparable happened. Slowly, the catalog of terrible outcomes Isabella had been maintaining in her head began to thin, not all at once, but week by week, in the way that fear thins when confronted honestly rather than avoided. Liam went back to his regular life and mostly stayed there. He finished the job at the Hart estate through a different contact, who managed the final days, and moved on to a small commercial property that needed rewiring, then a split-level residence in the East Hills, whose basement had developed a drainage problem. He drove Mia to school and picked her up and helped with her homework, and took her to the public pool on Saturdays, and his life was ordinary and sufficient, and his own. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. He did not respond to the 2 media inquiries that reached him through his business contact information. He had nothing to say to anyone about it except what he had already done, which was the only kind of statement he had ever found satisfying. Some people fixed broken pipes. Some people fixed broken systems. He had always believed, in his quieter moments, that these were not entirely different activities. The afternoon in early autumn when Isabella called to ask if Mia might like to spend a Saturday afternoon with Evelyn at the community recreation center was one of those moments that does not announce its own significance. He had paused. He had looked at his daughter, who was at the kitchen table drawing a horse that was, honestly, anatomically questionable but rendered with great confidence and evident joy. He had said yes. He had spoken to Mia about it simply and honestly, that there was a girl her age, who hadn't been around other kids in a while, and who might be shy at first, and would Mia be willing to give her some time to warm up? Mia had thought about this with the serious consideration she brought to most things, nodded, and gone back to her horse. The 2 girls met on a bright October Saturday at the edge of the recreation center's outdoor play area. With Liam and Isabella standing back at a distance that was close enough to supervise but far enough to allow. Evelyn had been quiet at first, watchful in the way Liam remembered, assessing. Mia had offered, within approximately 90 seconds of introduction, to teach Evelyn a game she had invented that appeared to involve a combination of tag and an elaborate set of rules that only Mia fully understood. Evelyn had looked at her with the careful expression of someone who had learned not to expect much, and then something in her face had shifted, a small sudden movement like a window being opened in a room that has been sealed too long, and she had laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and immediate, the kind that comes before the mind can decide whether it is appropriate. The 2 girls ran through Mia's invented rules with the complete unself-consciousness of children who have found a frequency they share, and the afternoon opened up around them like something finally allowed to breathe. The 2 adults standing nearby did not speak. They stood in the October sun and watched, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the afternoon wasn't already saying in a clearer and more complete language than either of them possessed. 2 children, laughing in October light. 2 people standing quietly beside each other, not because they had resolved everything between them, not because anything was simple or finished or without cost, but because the thing that had been broken was, in this moment, being repaired in the only way that broken things are ever truly repaired, not by being sealed away from the world, but by being gently, patiently returned to it.